wondered where the expression warts and all comes from? Well, even if you haven't, you're in luck, because I'm going to tell you. If you're a little bit familiar with English history, maybe you've heard the name of Oliver Cromwell. He's the one who, back in the 1600s, overthrew King Charles I and took over the top leadership position in England, declaring himself to be the Lord Protector. Some years later, when it came time for Oliver Cromwell's official portrait to be done, he basically said to the artist, "I want you to paint me just as I am. Don't try to flatter me and change things about me. Take a close look at my pimples, my blemishes, and paint me just like that, warts and all." Well, the artist was somewhat shocked to hear that, because especially in that day, it was customary for a painter to take out the unpleasant images of the person that he was painting. Much like even today when you have your picture taken, the photographer is able to use airbrushing and other techniques so that they're able to take a picture of someone who looks like me and make it look halfway decent. But Oliver Cromwell didn't want the artist to do that to his portrait. And so, to this day, when you go to the British National Art Gallery in London, Oliver Cromwell's portrait is hanging there with a big wart right underneath his lower lip. He didn't see any reason to try and hide the truth about himself. And so he had himself painted, warts and all. As we read this psalm, Psalm 90, we're presented with a picture of life just as it is. No airbrushing, no retouching. As we read this psalm, Psalm 90, we're presented with a realistic view of life, warts and all. Essentially, this psalm contains a crying out to God, perhaps out of frustration, that from God's point of view, time just doesn't matter. That from God's perspective, 1 year, or 100 years, or 1,000 years, or 1,000,000 years, or even 1,000,000,000 years are all virtually the same to God, since God is eternal, without beginning or end. But we as human beings are mortal. And so that means that time does matter for us. If we're lucky, the psalm says, we might live 70 or 80 years, or perhaps a little longer than that. But sooner or later, one day, our lives here on this earth come to an end. We're like blades of grass, the psalm writer says. When life is new and the fresh dew is upon us, we have strength and vigor. But as the heat of the days continually beats down upon us, eventually our strength is taken from us until we wither and die. And even during the years of life we are given, much of that time is filled with heartaches and fears and worries. Much of that time is filled with sickness and pain and troubles. It's like the poem that Carl Sandburg wrote, which is often considered to be the shortest poem that has ever been written in the English language. It goes like this: born, troubled, die. Born, troubled, die. And to a large degree, that's what this psalm is saying. We're born. As the years pass, we face different kinds of trouble, and then we eventually die. But the question that this psalm raises, which is also a question that we have, is that all there is? To be born, to suffer troubles, and then to die. Maybe you're familiar with the old Christian hymn that goes like this. You put your right hand in, you put your right hand out. You put your right hand in and you shake it all about. You do the hokey pokey and turn yourself around. That's what it's all about. Is the hokey pokey all that it's about? Or is there something more? Among the Catholic monks known as the Trappists, they have a rather unique way of greeting one another. You see, when they greet one another, they don't usually say hello or hi, how are you doing? Instead, when they greet one another, they say, remember that you will die. In saying that, they're not trying to be downers. Rather, with that greeting, remember that you will die, they're encouraging each other to put their lives into perspective. They're inviting each other to consider the unique opportunity that God has given us in life. After all, this is the only human life that we will ever have. It's not as though we're given 5 or 6 tries to get it right. And so by saying, remember that you will die, those Trappist monks are encouraging us to think about what we're really doing with our time, to learn to count our days, and to consider whether we're using our time and energy on things that ultimately don't matter or last, or whether we're using our time and energy on those things that ultimately do matter and last. Namely, living our lives based on a deep and abiding relationship with God. The ancient church leader and theologian named Augustine put it this way. He said, our hearts are restless until they find their rest in God. In other words, according to Augustine, we're going to feel an emptiness and an uneasiness and a lack of real meaning in our lives until we finally come to discover that God alone can give us that meaning that we're searching for. That only what is rooted in and directed toward God will ultimately last and matter. If you read the Gospel of John, it's important to note how the Gospel writer uses the present tense when referring to eternal life. For instance, in the 6th chapter of John's Gospel, Jesus is quoted as saying, "Very truly I tell you, whoever believes